Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we descend into the wetlands of America, places where solid ground becomes negotiable, where fog erases horizons, and where emergency calls from the marshes carry voices that searchers can never seem to find. Across the Gulf Coast, the Carolinas, the Everglades, and the bayous of Louisiana are recorded distress signals drawn from Coast Guard transcripts, Wildlife Service reports, and archived 911 recordings. Each account verified through dispatch logs and witness testimony, retold exactly as they were documented. These are not stories of simple accidents. They are encounters with something the marshlands conceal, something that answers when you call for help, but should not be trusted. Something that understands the human impulse to rescue and uses that compassion as bait. The wetlands have always been places of transition. Neither fully land nor fully water, they exist in a state of perpetual change. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. What was walkable becomes impassable. What was visible disappears beneath murky water. And in that constant state of flux, things can hide or wait. Now let us begin with our first story. It was the third week of September 2009. The Outer Banks of North Carolina had been battered by tropical rain for 6 consecutive days. Highway 12 flooded in sections, forcing detours that added hours to local commutes. The marshes between Hatteras and Ocracoke swelled beyond their banks, turning familiar channels into featureless gray water that stretched unbroken to the mist. Coast Guard Station Hatteras Inlet logged 14 distress calls that week. Most were fishing boats caught in currents. A few were stranded motorists on submerged roads. All were routine until the call came in at 11:17 p.m. on September 22nd. The voice on the marine radio was male, mid-30s, steady but strained. He identified himself as Peter Arnold, solo fisherman operating a 16-foot aluminum skiff 2 miles southwest of Hatteras Inlet. He reported engine failure and rapidly rising water. His GPS coordinates placed him in a section of marsh known locally as the Shallows, a braided network of channels that shifted with every storm. Local fishermen avoided the area after dark. The channels were deceptive, full of hidden sandbars and submerged stumps. Even in daylight, navigation required constant attention. Petty Officer Daniel Kraus took the call and dispatched a rescue boat within 4 minutes. Kraus had been stationed at Hatteras for 3 years. He knew the waters, knew the storms, knew how quickly conditions could deteriorate. He assigned 3 guardsmen to the response boat and monitored their progress from the station's radio room. The rescue team consisted of Petty Officers Marcus Webb, Jennifer Cho, and Tyler Mason, all experienced in night operations. They departed the station at 11:23 aboard a 25-foot response boat equipped with spotlights, thermal imaging, and GPS navigation. The fog had thickened since the initial call. Visibility dropped to less than 30 feet. The beam from their spotlight reflected back as a diffuse white glow that revealed nothing beyond the water directly ahead. They reached the reported coordinates by 11:41. Webb cut the engine and let the boat drift. The silence was immediate and complete. No waves breaking, no wind through the grass, no sound of another boat. They found no skiff, no debris, no sign of distress. What they found instead was another voice on the radio. "This is Peter Arnold," the voice said. "I'm about a quarter mile south of you now. Engine's still dead. Water's coming in fast." Webb acknowledged and checked the new coordinates. They had changed by 0.23 miles. The rescue boat adjusted course and proceeded south through narrow channels choked with cordgrass. The marsh grass grew 8 feet tall in some places, forming walls that blocked any view beyond the immediate channel. The water was black, reflecting nothing. Mason operated the thermal camera, scanning for heat signatures. The screen showed only cold water and colder vegetation. 18 minutes later, they arrived at the new location. Again, they found nothing. No skiff, no heat signature, no disturbance in the water. The radio crackled a third time. "I see your lights," Arnaud said. "I'm waving. Can you see me?" Cho responded, asking Arnaud to describe exactly what he was seeing. Petty Officer Kraus, listening from the station, leaned closer to his radio. There was a pause longer than static should allow. The silence carried weight, as if something were considering its answer. Then the voice returned, quieter. "You're close," it said. "Real close now." Webb scanned the darkness with the spotlight, sweeping it in slow arcs across the marsh. The beam caught nothing but grass and water. No movement, no shape, no reflection of aluminum hull or human form. He asked Arnaud to fire a flare if he had one, or to use his boat horn, or to shine a flashlight, anything that would provide a visual reference point. The response was immediate. "I don't have flares. My flashlight's dead. But I can see you clearly. You're in a white boat. There are 3 of you. One is operating the spotlight." The details were accurate. Webb felt his grip tighten on the wheel. He asked Arnaud how far away he was. The voice said less than 100 feet. Webb ordered Mason to scan with the thermal camera in a full circle. Mason did so, slowly, covering every degree. The screen remained empty except for their own heat signatures. The rescue team circled the area for another 40 minutes. They called Arnaud's name through a loudspeaker, the amplified voice booming across the water and echoing back from the grass. They fired illumination flares that turned the fog into drifting orange clouds, casting strange shadows that moved and shifted with the wind. Each flare burned for 30 seconds, lighting the marsh in apocalyptic orange before fading back to darkness. No response came except through the radio, and each time the voice spoke, the coordinates shifted further into the marsh. Krauss, monitoring from the station, ran the name Peter Arnaud through Coast Guard databases. The search returned nothing. No registered boat owner by that name. No active distress beacon. No filed float plan. He tried calling the phone number associated with the marine radio transmission. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The voicemail greeting was generic, automated, giving no name. By 1:30 a.m., the tide had turned and the channels were becoming impassable. Sandbars that had been submerged now broke the surface. The boat scraped bottom twice, forcing Webb to back off and find alternate routes. He made the decision to return to station and resume at first light. The radio crackled one final time as they turned back. "You're leaving," Arnaud said. It was not a question. The tone carried something between disappointment and resignation. Webb did not respond. They reached the station at 2:17 a.m., exhausted and confused. Krauss debriefed them, taking detailed notes. None of them could explain what had happened. The calls had been clear, the voice consistent, the coordinates precise. But there had been nothing out there. At dawn, a helicopter survey was conducted. The MH-65 Dolphin flew a grid pattern over the shallows, covering a 10-mile radius. The pilot and rescue swimmer observed through binoculars and thermal imaging. The marsh appeared exactly as it should: grass, water, sandbars, the occasional hunting blind. No wreckage was located. No skiff matching Arnaud's description was found within 10 miles of the reported area. The Coast Guard contacted the phone number listed on the distress call. It belonged to a Peter Arnaud of Nag's Head, but when reached that afternoon, he stated he had not been fishing that night. He had not been on the water at all. His boat was tied to his dock, covered with a tarp. He had never owned a marine radio. He asked why the Coast Guard was calling him. Krauss explained the situation. Arnaud was silent for a long moment, then said he wanted no further involvement. The voice on the recording was analyzed by communications specialists. It matched no known missing persons. The vocal patterns were consistent throughout the transmission, showing no signs of stress or panic that would be expected from someone whose boat was sinking. The accent was local, coastal Carolina, but generic enough that it could have belonged to any of 10,000 men in the region. Dispatch logs confirmed the call had originated from within the marsh, transmitted on Channel 16, the international distress frequency. The signal strength suggested a transmission source within 2 miles of the coordinates provided. But nothing was there. The case was classified as unresolved and filed under incident number CGNC-09417. No further calls were received from that frequency. But Coast Guard personnel at Hatteras Inlet began reporting strange occurrences over the following months. Radios would activate on their own during night shifts, emitting only static. Spotlights would flicker when pointed toward the shallows. And on foggy nights, when the wind died and the marsh fell silent, Some claimed they could hear a voice calling from the water, distant, faint, asking if anyone could see him. The recording still exists in the station's archives, stored on a digital server with dozens of other distress calls. On quiet nights, junior officers are told not to listen to it alone. Those who have report feeling an overwhelming urge to respond, to grab a boat and head out into the marsh, even though they know there is nothing to find. 300 miles south, another rescue team was about to learn that some calls for help should never be answered. It was late April of 2014. The Okefenokee Swamp sprawls across the border of Georgia and Florida, 438,000 acres of blackwater channels, cypress domes, and floating peat islands called batteries that drift with the current. The swamp is ancient, its waters stained dark by tannic acid leached from decaying vegetation. Visibility beneath the surface is measured in inches. The channels twist and divide, forming a maze that has disoriented experienced guides and claimed the lives of those who ventured too deep without proper navigation. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources maintains a small ranger station on the eastern edge near Folkestone. The station operates with a skeleton crew, 2 full-time rangers, 1 wildlife officer, and a rotating cast of seasonal workers. On April 27th at 2:14 p.m., the station received a distress call from a kayaker reported missing since the previous afternoon. The caller identified herself as Rachel Sims, 29, solo paddler, who had launched from the Suwannee Canal entrance 48 hours prior. She stated she had become disoriented after her kayak capsized in a narrow channel, and that she was now stranded on a floating island with no clear route back to open water. Her cell phone battery was at 8%. She provided approximate coordinates based on landmarks. She could describe a dead cypress with a split trunk, a channel that bent sharply east, and what she called the smell of something rotting. The description was vague, but not unusual. The Okefenokee was full of dead trees, sharp bends, and the pervasive smell of decomposition. Everything in the swamp eventually rotted. It was the nature of the place. Ranger Thomas Everett and Wildlife Officer Julia Mendez launched an airboat within 20 minutes. Everett had worked the swamp for 12 years. He knew the channels better than most, though he would be the first to admit that no one truly knew the Okefenokee. The swamp changed, islands drifted, channels filled with vegetation overnight. What had been passable one week could be blocked the next. They carried GPS units, thermal imaging equipment, and enough supplies for an overnight search if necessary. The weather was clear, temperature in the low 80s, humidity oppressive even by swamp standards. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, like trying to inhale through wet cloth. They entered the canal system at 2:37 p.m. and proceeded west into the interior. The Okefenokee is not silent. Frogs call in overlapping rhythms, creating a chorus that rises and falls like breathing. Cicadas hum in waves. Gators bellow from submerged logs, their voices carrying for miles. Birds screech and whistle. The swamp is alive with sound. But as Everett and Mendez moved deeper into the channel system, they noticed a gradual absence of sound. The frogs fell quiet first, then the insects. The birds stopped calling. By the time they were 3 miles in, the only sound was the low throb of the airboat's engine. The water turned darker, almost black, reflecting nothing but the sky above. The cypress trees leaned inward, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hung like funeral curtains. The air smelled of sulfur and decay, sharp enough to make Mendez cover her nose. Everett had smelled it before it came from pockets of methane rising from decomposing vegetation at the bottom of the swamp. But this was stronger than usual, almost overwhelming. They reached the coordinates Sims had described at 4:32 p.m. No kayaker, no floating island matching her description. The area looked like every other part of the swamp: dark water, tangled vegetation, cypress knees jutting from the surface like broken teeth. They cut the engine and called her name. The echo traveled across the water and returned too quickly, as if bouncing off something unseen just beyond the trees. Mendez tried the radio. No response. She dialed Sims's cell phone number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice answered. "I can hear you," Sims said. "You're really close." Mendez felt relief flood through her. She asked Sims to describe exactly what she could see. Sims described the airboat in precise detail: its white hull, the elevated operator platform, the orange rescue bag strapped to the bow, even the dent in the left pontoon where Everett had struck a submerged log 2 weeks earlier. Mendez turned in a slow circle, scanning every direction with binoculars. There was no one visible within 100 yards. "Where are you standing?" Mendez asked. "Right in front of you," Sims replied. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful. "I'm waving. Can you see me?" Mendez looked directly ahead. There was nothing but water and cypress trees. She asked Sims to describe what she was wearing. Sims described Mendez's uniform green shirt, khaki pants, the DNR badge on her left shoulder. She described Everett standing behind the controls, his hand on the throttle, his sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. Every detail was correct. The call disconnected. Mendez redialed immediately. The phone rang, but no one answered. She tried 3 more times. Nothing. Everett restarted the engine, and they began searching in widening circles, calling through a megaphone, firing signal flares that burst red against the darkening sky. At dusk, with visibility dropping to near zero, they were forced to retreat due to navigational hazards. The channels that had been clearly marked during the day became indistinguishable in the dark. A full-scale search resumed the following morning with 4 boats and a helicopter. The helicopter flew low over the swamp, its rotors beating the air and bending the treetops. Observers scanned with binoculars and thermal cameras. The boats spread out, each taking a different section of the interior channels. They searched for 3 days, covering over 20 square miles of swamp. They found nothing. No trace of Rachel Sims was ever found. No kayak, no gear, no body, no piece of clothing caught on a branch. The Georgia DNR contacted her family in Savannah on the 4th day. They confirmed she had planned a solo trip to the Okefenokee, mentioning it in passing during a family dinner 2 weeks earlier. But when shown photographs of kayaking equipment, her mother said Rachel had never learned to kayak. She had always been afraid of deep water, ever since nearly drowning as a child at a community pool. The phone number used to call for rescue was registered to Rachel Sims. The phone itself pinged off a cell tower near Folkestone on April 27th at 2:14 p.m., the exact time of the distress call. Cell tower triangulation placed the phone within the swamp at the time of the calls. But Rachel's phone was later found in her apartment in Savannah, sitting on her kitchen counter, fully charged, with no recent calls in its history. Investigators examined the phone records. The last call Rachel had made was 3 days before the distress call, to a restaurant confirming a reservation. Her apartment showed no signs of disturbance. Her car was parked in its assigned spot. Her work had reported her absent for 2 days, but that was not unusual. She worked freelance as a graphic designer and often took personal days. The case remains open. Ranger Everett transferred to a different district 6 months later, taking a position at a state park near the coast where the ground was solid and you could see for miles. He will not discuss what he heard that day in the Okefenokee, but colleagues report that he refuses to enter any body of water deeper than his ankles. Officer Mendez still works in the region, but she no longer answers distress calls in the swamp's interior. She patrols the perimeter, the visitor center, the clearly marked trails. When asked about the Sims incident, she says only that some places in the swamp should be left alone. In the wetlands of Louisiana, a hunting guide was about to receive the strangest rescue request of his 30-year career. It was mid-November of 2016. The Atchafalaya Basin is the largest river swamp in the United States, a maze of bayous and backwater channels that flood seasonally across nearly 1 million acres of southern Louisiana. The basin serves as an overflow relief for the Mississippi River, and water levels can rise by 10 feet or more during spring floods. During hunting season, the basin attracts hundreds of sportsmen who navigate its channels in search of ducks, deer, and wild hogs. Some know the waterways well. Others do not return. Marcel Thibodeau had guided hunters and fishermen through the basin since he was 19 years old. He was now 49, with sun-weathered skin and hands calloused from decades of handling ropes and boat throttles. He knew every channel, every submerged log, every place where the water ran faster than it appeared. His reputation was solid, safe, reliable, knowledgeable. People hired him because he brought them back alive. On November 14th, he received a call on his satellite phone from a number he did not recognize. The satellite phone was expensive to operate, and Thibodeau gave the number only to clients and emergency services. Most calls came through his regular cell phone. This one bypassed that entirely. The caller was a man who gave his name as David Cormier. He spoke with a Cajun accent, old and measured, the kind of accent that was becoming rare as younger generations moved away from the basin. Cormier explained that he had been hired by a family to locate their son, a college student from Baton Rouge, who had gone missing 3 days earlier while camping near Bayou Sorel. Cormier said he was a private investigator and that he had tracked the young man's last known location to a section of swamp accessible only by boat. He offered Thibodeau $800 to guide him to the coordinates he had been given. $800 was more than Thibodeau usually charged for a full day. He asked why the family had not contacted the sheriff's department or the Coast Guard. Cormier said they had, but official searches had been suspended after 48 hours with no results. The family wanted to continue looking on their own. Thibodeau understood. He had seen it before, families who could not accept that the swamp sometimes kept what it took. They arranged to meet at the Henderson boat launch at 6 a.m. the following morning. When Thibodeau arrived, the parking lot was empty. The sun had not yet risen. The air was cold, the water still. He waited by his truck, drinking coffee from a thermos. By 6:15, no one had arrived. He tried calling the number back. It rang once and went to a voicemail box that had not been set up. He waited 30 minutes, then prepared to leave. As he was loading his thermos back into the truck, his satellite phone rang. "I'm already out here," Cormier said. "Had to get an early start. Wanted to scout the area before we went in deep. Can you meet me at the old cistern off Bayou Benoit?" Thibodeau knew the place, a crumbling brick structure half submerged in a channel that had been abandoned since the 70s. It had once been part of an irrigation system for rice fields that no longer existed. The cistern was an hour by boat from Henderson, deep enough into the swamp that even experienced guides avoided it after dark. The water around it was unpredictable, full of submerged debris and sudden drop-offs. But $800 was $800. Thibodeau agreed, launched his flatboat, and headed west into the basin. The morning was still. Fog hung in layers across the water, drifting in patches that obscured and revealed in turns. Herons stood motionless on cypress knees, waiting for fish. A gator slid from a log with barely a splash, disappearing beneath the black surface. Thibodeau followed Bayou Benoit until he reached the cistern, a moss-covered dome rising from black water, its interior filled with silt and rotting wood. The structure was larger than he remembered, or perhaps the water level had dropped. Bricks had fallen away in places, exposing the hollow interior. Trees grew from cracks in the dome, their roots spreading across the surface like veins. There was no other boat, no sign anyone had been there in years. The water around the cistern was perfectly still, reflecting the sky in dark mirror. Thibodeau cut the engine and listened. The swamp breathed around him, the drip of condensation from branches, the distant splash of something entering the water, the rustle of wings. Normal sounds, nothing alarming. His satellite phone buzzed. "You're here," Cormier said. "Good. Now head south about 200 yards. You'll see a channel on your right. Follow it." Thibodeau looked south. He could see no channel, only a solid wall of vegetation. He told Cormier this. Cormier insisted it was there, that Thibodeau just needed to get closer. Thibodeau restarted the engine and proceeded slowly. After 200 yards, a narrow gap appeared in the vegetation barely wide enough for his boat. He would have missed it entirely if he had not been looking directly at it. He turned into the channel. It was narrow, choked with duckweed that parted reluctantly as the boat pushed through. Branches scraped the aluminum sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. The channel twisted left, then right, then left again. Thibodeau lost his sense of direction. The sun was hidden by fog and trees. His compass showed south, then west, then north within the span of a minute. Magnetic anomalies were common in the swamp, caused by iron deposits in the soil, but this was extreme. After 3 minutes, The channel opened into a small pond ringed by dead trees. In the center of the pond was another boat, a wooden pirogue, old and weathered, drifting without anchor. The pirogue was the traditional boat of the Atchafalaya, hand-carved from cypress logs, used for centuries before aluminum and fiberglass. But this one looked ancient, its wood dark and soft with rot. Thibodeau pulled alongside it. The pirogue was empty except for a coil of rope and a rusted tackle box. He called out. No answer. The pond was silent except for the idle of his engine. He tried the phone again. Not that one, Cormier said. Keep going. There's another channel at the far end. Thibodeau looked across the pond. He saw no channel, only more dead trees. But when he reached the far side, another narrow gap appeared, as if the vegetation had parted just for him. He followed the new channel for 10 minutes, emerging into another clearing, and then another. Each time, there was something waiting, a piece of equipment, an abandoned camp, a marker of some kind. And each time, Cormier's voice told him to keep going. For the next 2 hours, Thibodeau followed directions given over the phone. Each location Cormier described appeared exactly as stated, even though Thibodeau had never seen these places before. The voice remained calm, polite, insistent. It described landmarks Thibodeau knew but had not mentioned. It told him to turn before he reached dead ends he had not yet seen. It guided him deeper into sections of the basin he had sworn he would never enter. By noon, Thibodeau realized he was lost. The channels had become unfamiliar. The sun was directly overhead, offering no sense of direction. His compass spun uselessly. He tried to retrace his route, but every turn looked identical. When he checked his GPS, the screen showed only static, the satellite signal blocked by something he could not identify. His phone rang one final time. "You should stop looking," Cormier said. The voice was different now, harder, colder, carrying an edge of warning. Thibodeau asked what Cormier meant. There was a long pause, filled only with the hiss of static. Then the voice spoke again. "Some people don't want to be found. Some people need to stay lost. You should go home now." The line went dead. Thibodeau tried calling back. The number would not connect. He sat in his boat, adrift in a clearing he did not recognize, and tried to control the panic rising in his chest. He was 50 years old, had spent 30 years in this swamp, and he had no idea where he was. He spent the rest of the day navigating by instinct, following the current, looking for channels that seemed more open than others. At one point, he passed the cistern again, though he could not remember making a circle. He saw the same dead trees, the same abandoned pirogue, as if the swamp were looping back on itself. Finally, just before sunset, he emerged onto Bayou Pigeon, a waterway he recognized. He followed it north to Henderson and reached the boat launch at dusk, exhausted and disoriented. That evening, he called the sheriff's office in Assumption Parish and reported the incident. A deputy took his statement and ran the phone number. It had been disconnected for 6 years, registered to a satellite service that no longer operated. The deputy asked if Thibodeau could lead them back to the locations he had visited. Thibodeau said no. He could not remember the route, could not describe the channels in any way that would be useful. It was as if the memory had been erased, leaving only the feeling of being led deeper and deeper into darkness. A search of public records showed that a David Cormier had worked as a hunting guide in the Atchafalaya Basin during the 1970s. He drowned in Bayou Benoit in 1978 after his boat capsized during a storm. His body was never recovered, though search teams spent 3 weeks looking for it. Cormier had been guiding a client at the time, a college student from Baton Rouge who also drowned. Neither body was found. Thibodeau sold his boat the following spring. He has not returned to the basin since. When asked about that day, he says only that the swamp is not empty, that there are things in the water, things in the fog, things that know your name and know how to call you. On the coast of South Carolina, a fisherman was about to discover that the tide brings back more than it takes away. In the mangrove forests of Florida, a wildlife officer was about to learn that some rescues are better left unattempted. It was mid-November of 2019, the tail end of hurricane season, when the last of the storms had passed. But the wetlands still held the memory of rising tides and shifting currents. The 10,000 Islands Wildlife Refuge, a maze of mangrove tunnels and brackish channels south of Chokolosky, was quieter than usual, stripped of tourists by the lingering humidity and the heavy stillness that settles over the Gulf as winter approaches. The mangroves stood tangled and ancient, roots arching above the water like skeletal hands, their canopies thick enough to turn daylight into dim green twilight. Officer Daniel Ruiz had worked these waters for 11 years. He knew every shortcut, every hidden lagoon, every place where the current turned unexpectedly. His job was part law enforcement, part search and rescue, part wilderness diplomacy. The mangroves were not kind to those who wandered in without knowledge. Their roots snagged propellers, their channels twisted without warning, and their silence could swallow a person whole. Ruiz respected the mangroves in a way that bordered on reverence. They had taught him that nature was not chaotic but anciently organized, following rules humans rarely understood. On November 14th at 4:22 p.m., Ruiz received a distress call routed through the county dispatch. The voice belonged to a young man, early 20s, frightened but coherent, who identified himself as Tyler. He said he'd been kayaking with two friends when they became separated in the maze of mangroves. His kayak had flipped after hitting a submerged root, and though he'd managed to climb onto a tangle of branches, he was injured and couldn't move without falling into the water. He didn't know his precise location but repeated that he could hear airboats from somewhere nearby. Ruiz launched from the ranger station within minutes. With daylight fading, he pushed his skiff through the narrow channels, relying on muscle memory as much as navigation. He radioed Tyler directly to keep him talking, to maintain a verbal signal he could follow. The young man described the sound of Ruiz's engine before Ruiz believed he was close enough for anyone to hear it. "You're coming toward me," Tyler said, voice trembling. "I can hear you on my left. Please hurry." Ruiz slowed his engine, letting it idle as he listened. The mangroves amplified and distorted sound. A cry could bounce through the tunnels like an echo chamber, making direction nearly impossible to determine. But he trusted his instincts. He glided deeper into a shadowed corridor where the canopy blotted out most of the sky. "I'm here," Tyler said through the radio. "I can see your boat." Ruiz froze. He swept a spotlight across the water, nothing but green-black reflection, shifting mangrove roots, and tiny ripples made by mullet darting beneath the surface. No kayak, no person. "Wave your arm if you can," Ruiz said. "Describe what you see." A long silence followed. Then, "You're wearing a tan uniform. You have sunglasses on top of your hat. Your boat has a silver anchor clipped to the port side." Accurate. Perfectly accurate. Details visible only from very close range. Ruiz felt a slow tightening in his chest. He raised his spotlight again. The glare illuminated nothing but roots and water, as if the mangroves were swallowing his beam. "How far are you from me?" he asked. "Very close," Tyler whispered. "Please help." The whisper was wrong. Too close, too intimate, as if spoken from just over Ruiz's shoulder rather than through a radio. Ruiz turned sharply, light slicing through the dark, but for a moment he swore he saw movement just beyond the reach of the beam, a shape slipping into deeper shadow, something slender, something upright. He steadied himself and forced rational thinking to replace instinctive fear. Mangroves played tricks, sound warped, light misled, people panicked. He reminded himself of every lecture he'd ever given trainees, and yet none of it eased the cold ache creeping up his spine. "Stay where you are," Ruiz said. "I'm triangulating your position." No response. "Tyler, talk to me." Silence. Then, abruptly, the sound of water dripping. Slow, rhythmic. Not from his boat, not from the channel. Dripping as though something were suspended above the water, just out of sight. Ruiz killed his engine and listened. The dripping grew louder, and then the voice came through the radio again. "Why can't you see me?" Ruiz felt the world tilt. His breath stuttered. He looked around slowly, deliberately, scanning the branches above. A raccoon, a bird, a broken mangrove root. That's what he told himself he would find. But the canopy was still. No wind, no motion, no perched animals. only that slow drip of unseen water. He started the engine. "I'm pulling back," he said. "Additional search teams will sweep the area." "You're leaving?" Tyler asked, his voice rising. "Please, don't leave me. I've been here so long." The radio crackled, a burst of static. Then his own voice echoed back at him, not Tyler's, but Ruiz's voice repeating the words he had spoken minutes earlier. "Stay where you are. I'm triangulating your position." The mangroves absorbed the sound, throwing it back distorted. The effect chilled him. He shut off the radio and powered full throttle toward open water, refusing to look back into the dark tangle behind him. He called dispatch once he reached a clear channel and requested a full-scale search. 2 boats and a helicopter combed the area until nightfall. No overturned kayak, no footprints on exposed mudflats, no evidence of a struggle. No missing persons reports matched anyone named Tyler, and the radio logs showed no incoming distress calls at 4:22 p.m. The frequency Ruiz had received the call on had been inactive. The next morning, Ruiz returned with a partner. He would not go alone again. They found nothing. The mangrove tunnel where the call had originated looked exactly like every other tunnel, dense, ancient, and indifferent. Over the next month, 4 fishermen reported hearing the same voice on Channel 9, always near dusk, always asking for help, always saying he could see them, and always ending with the same question Ruiz had heard. "Why can't you see me?" No one ever found a body. No one ever filed a missing persons report that fit the details, and no one, not even Ruiz, ever answered the voice again. He transferred to Inland Patrol the next year. The mangroves still whisper at dusk, and local officers keep their radios turned down when traveling near the old tunnel. Because in the 10,000 islands, the water remembers, the roots listen, and some voices, for reasons no one understands, refuse to stay silent. It was early February of 2020. The 10,000 islands form a labyrinth of mangrove-covered islets along the southwestern coast of Florida, stretching from Marco Island to Cape Sable. The name is misleading. There are not actually 10,000 islands. The number is closer to several hundred, depending on how you define an island and whether you count the smallest hammocks that appear only at low tide. But the maze is real. The channels twist and divide, double back on themselves, create loops that can trap the unwary. Even experienced guides rely on GPS to avoid becoming lost among the identical channels and tidal flats. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Officer Daniel Ruiz patrolled the region as part of his jurisdiction, enforcing fishing regulations and conducting search operations when tourists inevitably became disoriented in the mangroves. He had worked the area for 6 years and had lost count of how many people he had guided back to civilization, kayakers who had paddled into dead ends, fishermen whose engines had died in remote channels, snorkelers who had drifted too far from their boats. Most of the time, people were embarrassed but grateful. Sometimes they were hypothermic or dehydrated. Occasionally they were injured, but they were almost always alive. On February 7th, at 4:41 p.m., Ruiz received a call on his satellite phone from a woman who identified herself as Jennifer Lasco. She stated she and her husband had been kayaking near Rabbit Key Pass when her husband, Mark, had paddled ahead and disappeared into a side channel. That had been 3 hours ago. She had searched for him, calling his name, but received no response. She had tried his cell phone, no signal. She had paddled into several channels looking for him, but they all looked the same, and she was afraid of getting lost herself. Her phone battery was dying. She sounded exhausted and frightened. Ruiz obtained her approximate coordinates and told her to stay where she was, that he would reach her as quickly as possible. He launched his patrol boat from the Everglades City Marina and headed south into the islands. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the water. The mangroves formed walls on either side of the channels, their roots tangled and impenetrable, their branches reaching overhead to create tunnels of green. Ruiz knew the area well. Rabbit Key Pass was a popular route for kayakers, clearly marked on maps, relatively easy to navigate if you paid attention. But the side channels were deceptive. One wrong turn could lead to a dead end or a tidal flat that only filled at high water. He reached the coordinates at 5:32 p.m. and found Jennifer Lasco in a yellow kayak, drifting near the mouth of a narrow channel. She was pale, her face streaked with dried tears and salt residue from the spray. Her hands were blistered from paddling. She wore a life jacket and a sun hat, both soaked through. Ruiz pulled alongside and helped stabilize her boat, clipping it to his own with a quick-release line. She told him her husband had entered the channel to the west and had not returned. They had been arguing earlier, something stupid, she said, about which way to turn. Mark had insisted on checking out the side channel. She had wanted to stick to the main route. He had paddled ahead, saying he would be back in 15 minutes. That was 3 hours ago. Ruiz asked if she had heard anything, a shout, a splash, any sound that might indicate where he had gone. She shook her head. The mangroves had swallowed him. One moment he was visible, paddling into the channel, and the next he was gone, hidden by the terns and the foliage. He just disappeared, she said, like the mangroves swallowed him. Ruiz secured her kayak to his boat and motored into the western channel. The passage was barely 10 feet wide, the water shallow and tannic, stained brown by the tannins leached from the mangrove roots. The bottom was visible as dark mud and shell fragments. The mangroves leaned inward, forming a tunnel that blocked most of the sky. Visibility dropped. The air felt close, humid, hard to breathe. Ruiz called Mark's name through a loudspeaker, his voice booming off the mangrove walls and echoing back strangely, as if distorted by the vegetation. No response. He proceeded slowly, scanning both sides of the channel for any sign of a kayak or a person. The mangroves were dense, their roots forming barriers that nothing human could penetrate. Occasionally, he saw gaps between the roots, spaces dark and filled with shadow, but none were large enough for a person to enter. The channel curved left, then right, then left again. After 15 minutes, it split into 3 narrower passages, each barely wide enough for his boat. Ruiz chose the center route. The water became shallower, the bottom visible as dark mud and shell fragments. Barnacles clung to the roots, sharp enough to cut through skin. He cut the engine and drifted, listening. The mangroves rustled in a light breeze that had not been present moments before. Something moved in the branches, a bird perhaps, or a crab. The shadows shifted. The water lapped against the hull with soft, rhythmic sounds. Jennifer's voice called out from behind him, sharp with urgency. "He's over there." Ruiz turned. Jennifer was pointing to the left passage, her hand trembling. Her face had gone even paler, if that were possible. Ruiz restarted the engine and reversed back to the junction, then turned into the left channel. It narrowed further, forcing him to slow to a crawl. The mangroves closed overhead, blocking the sun. Only scattered patches of light filtered through, creating dappled patterns on the water. He called Mark's name again. No response. Only the sound of his own voice echoing back, distorted and strange. The channel ended in a small clearing ringed by tangled roots. The water was perhaps 20 feet across, forming a rough circle. In the center was an overturned kayak, blue, half submerged. Ruiz maneuvered closer and reached out to flip it. The kayak was empty. No paddle, no gear, no life jacket, no sign of its occupant. The kayak appeared undamaged, no holes, no cracks, nothing to suggest it had struck a rock or capsized violently. It was simply upside down, floating, abandoned. Ruiz scanned the water and the surrounding mangroves. Nothing moved except the shadows cast by the swaying branches. He called Mark's name louder, his voice carrying across the small clearing. The echo came back wrong, delayed by a fraction of a second too long. The air felt heavier now, pressing down. The smell of salt and decay was overwhelming. Jennifer was silent. Ruiz turned to ask her a question and realized she was staring at something behind him, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent expression of horror. He followed her gaze. Standing in the shallow water, partially obscured by roots, was a figure. It was too far away to make out details, perhaps 40 feet across the clearing, but it appeared to be a man tall, motionless, facing them. The figure stood in water that should have been knee-deep, but appeared to be standing on the surface, as if the mud beneath were solid ground. Ruiz called out, identifying himself as Fish and Wildlife Conservation Officer. The figure did not move. Ruiz called again, louder, saying he was there to help, asking if the person was Mark Lasco. The figure remained still, a dark shape against the darker mangroves. Ruiz decided to approach on foot. He killed the engine, radioed his position to dispatch, and stepped into the water. The bottom was soft, his boots sinking several inches into mud. Each step was an effort, pulling his feet free with sucking sounds. He waded toward the figure, moving carefully to avoid submerged roots. The water rose to his knees, then his thighs. The bottom became softer, more treacherous. He called out a third time, asking if the person needed help, asking for a response. The figure did not answer. It stood perfectly still, as if carved from shadow. As Ruiz got closer, he realized the figure was not standing in the water at all. It was standing on the surface, impossible as that seemed. There was no disturbance around its feet, no ripples, no indication it had displaced water, and as he watched, the figure turned slowly, not rotating on an axis, but sliding, as if moved by invisible wires, and walked deeper into the mangroves. It moved without sound, without disturbing the water, without breaking branches or rustling leaves. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the darkness between the roots, as if absorbed by the mangroves themselves. Ruiz stopped. The water around him felt suddenly colder. He stood motionless for several heartbeats, waiting for his breath to slow, trying to process what he had just seen. Finally, he turned and waded back to the boat. Jennifer was crying silently, tears running down her face. He asked her if that had been her husband. She shook her head violently. "Mark doesn't look like that," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Mark isn't that." Ruiz called for backup and a helicopter search. A team of 4 officers arrived within 40 minutes, bringing additional equipment and thermal imaging cameras. They searched the area until full darkness, using floodlights that turned the mangroves into a surreal landscape of harsh whites and deep blacks. Thermal imaging detected several heat signatures: raccoons, birds, a small alligator, but nothing human-sized. No trace of Mark Lasco was found. The overturned kayak was recovered and examined by forensic specialists. It bore no damage, no signs of struggle, no blood or tissue that would indicate violence. The kayak simply appeared to have been abandoned. Jennifer was escorted back to Everglades City and interviewed by investigators that evening. Her account remained consistent across multiple tellings. She described her husband paddling ahead, disappearing into the channel, failing to return. She described the search, the discovery of the kayak, the figure in the water. When asked to describe what she had seen in the mangroves, what the figure had looked like, she refused to answer. She said only that it had not been human, that it had worn her husband's shape, but had not been him. The investigators pressed, but she became hysterical and the interview was terminated. Mark Lasco's body was discovered 6 days later, floating in Chokoloskee Bay, 8 miles north of Rabbit Key Pass. A fishing boat found him at dawn, drifting face down among the mangrove islands. The body was recovered by Coast Guard and transported to the medical examiner in Naples. The autopsy listed cause of death as drowning, though the findings were unusual. Mark's lungs contained almost no water, less than would be expected for a drowning victim. His body showed no signs of trauma, no indication of struggle. Time of death was estimated at 72 hours before he was found, approximately the same time Jennifer reported him missing. But the body had been in the water for less than a day based on decomposition and marine life activity. Where it had been for the intervening 5 days remained unexplained. The case was closed as an accidental drowning. Officer Ruiz requested a transfer 3 months later, citing personal reasons. He now patrols inland lakes in central Florida and has not returned to the 10,000 islands. Colleagues who have worked with him report that he refuses to discuss the incident and becomes visibly uncomfortable when mangroves are mentioned. Jennifer Lasco moved back to Ohio shortly after the funeral. She has not returned to Florida. In the wetlands of eastern Texas, a park ranger was about to discover that some voices on the radio should not be believed. It was late March of 2021. Brazos Bend State Park occupies nearly 5,000 acres of coastal prairie and freshwater marsh 30 miles southwest of Houston. The park is known for its alligator population, hundreds of them, ranging from juveniles less than 2 feet long to massive adults over 12 feet. The gators are habituated to humans, which makes them even more dangerous. They show no fear, and visitors who ignore warning signs occasionally find themselves too close to an animal that can move surprisingly fast across short distances. The park features miles of trails that wind through wetlands and around shallow lakes. The Elm Lake Trail is one of the most popular, a 3-mile loop that offers excellent wildlife viewing. The trail is flat, well-maintained, clearly marked. During daylight hours, it is safe and accessible. After dark, it becomes something different. The alligators are more active at night, hunting along the water's edge. The mosquitoes swarm in clouds, and the darkness is absolute once you move beyond the parking lot lights. Ranger Olivia Brennan had worked the park for 4 years, conducting evening patrols and responding to after-hours emergencies. Most emergencies were minor visitors who had stayed past closing time, people who had lost their car keys, the occasional medical issue. Real crises were rare. On March 28th at 8:56 p.m., she received a radio call from a hiker reporting that he had fallen and injured his ankle on the Elm Lake Trail. The caller identified himself as Jason Pruitt. His voice was strained but coherent, carrying the tension of someone in pain but maintaining control. He stated he had been hiking alone, which was against park policy after dark, but not uncommon. He had stepped into a shallow depression obscured by tall grass, twisting his ankle. The snap had been audible. He believed the ankle was sprained, possibly fractured. He could not walk. He had tried, but the pain was too severe and the ankle would not support his weight. The trail was a 3-mile loop, and he estimated he was roughly halfway around, near the eastern observation platform. Brennan acknowledged the call and grabbed her medical kit from the ranger station. She radioed park dispatch to notify them of the situation, providing Pruitt's reported location and estimated time to reach him. Then she drove her utility vehicle to the Elm Lake trailhead. The park had officially closed at sunset 2 hours earlier, and the only light came from her headlights and a rising moon that provided minimal illumination through scattered clouds. She followed the trail on foot, carrying a powerful flashlight and calling Pruitt's name every few minutes. The night was humid, typical for late March in the Gulf coastal region. The temperature had dropped to the mid-60s, but the air still felt thick. Frogs called from the water in overlapping waves. Insects hummed in shifting clouds that gathered in the beam of her flashlight. Her boots crunched on the gravel trail. The marsh grass rustled in a light breeze. Everything sounded normal, routine, exactly as it should. Brennan reached the eastern observation platform at 9:23. The platform was a wooden structure elevated 10 feet above the marsh, offering views across Elm Lake and the surrounding wetlands. It was empty. She swept her flashlight across the surrounding area. The grass was tall and dense, the ground uneven where water pooled in low spots. Shadows moved as her light passed over them. She called Pruitt's name again. No response. She radioed him directly. "I'm at the platform," she said. "Where are you exactly?" Static crackled through the speaker. Then Pruitt's voice returned, still strained, still controlled. "I can see your light. I'm west of you, maybe 50 yards. Brennan turned and walked west along the trail, sweeping her light back and forth across the marsh. After 50 yards, she stopped and scanned the area again. Grass, water, darkness. Nothing else. No person lying on the ground. No movement except the sway of vegetation. She radioed back. "I'm not seeing you. Can you wave or make noise?" "I'm waving," Pruitt said. "Right in front of you. You're looking right at me." Brennan stood still. The grass shifted in the breeze. A night heron called from across the lake, its voice harsh and croaking. She moved her flashlight in slow arcs, covering every inch of visible ground, illuminating every shadow. There was no one. The trail ahead was empty. The marsh beside it showed no disturbance. She keyed the radio a third time and asked Pruitt to describe what he could see, to give her landmarks or features that would help pinpoint his location. "You're standing on the trail," Pruitt said. His voice was clearer now, less strained. "You're wearing a green shirt with a Park Service badge. You're holding a flashlight in your right hand. You're alone." The details were correct. Brennan felt a cold prickle run along her spine, raising the hairs on her arms. She turned in a full circle, shining her light into the grass behind trees across the water. The beam caught eyes an alligator, submerged except for its head, watching from 10 feet away. The eyes reflected red in the light, unblinking. Brennan gave the animal a wide berth and continued her sweep. She was alone. Completely, undeniably alone. "Where exactly are you injured?" she asked, keeping her voice steady and professional. "My left ankle," Pruitt replied. "I told you already, it's swollen pretty bad. I think I can see bone." Brennan asked him to describe the injury in more detail, the extent of the swelling, whether there was any bruising, whether he could move his toes. Pruitt answered each question with textbook precision. He described pain levels on a scale of 1 to 10. He mentioned lack of circulation indicated by numbness in his foot. He detailed his inability to bear weight without the ankle collapsing. His answers were almost too accurate, as if he were reading from a medical manual rather than reporting his own experience. Brennan asked how long he had been lying there, waiting for help. "About an hour and a half," Pruitt said. "Maybe longer, hard to keep track of time." Brennan checked her watch. The initial call had come in 43 minutes ago. She made note of the discrepancy, but did not mention it. Instead, she radioed dispatch and requested backup, providing her location and stating she was unable to locate the injured hiker. 2 additional rangers, Michael Chen and Sarah Rodriguez, arrived within 20 minutes. They searched the area in a grid pattern, using 3 flashlights to cover the entire loop trail and the surrounding wetlands. They called Pruitt's name. They checked the observation platform, the picnic areas, every bench and marker along the route. They found no injured hiker, no sign of disturbance, no evidence anyone had been on the trail that evening. At 11 p.m., after 2 hours of searching, Brennan radioed Pruitt again. He answered immediately, his voice unchanged. "Are you still coming?" he asked. There was no impatience in his tone, no frustration, just a simple question. Brennan asked for his full name and phone number, information that should have been collected in the initial call, but had been overlooked in the urgency of responding. Pruitt provided both without hesitation. She wrote them down in her notebook, the pen scratching across the paper. She later checked the information against park records and visitor logs. No one by the name of Jason Pruitt had registered at the park that day. No vehicle in the parking lot matched the license plate associated with the name. The phone number belonged to a disconnected landline that had last been in service in 2017. The Rangers continued searching until midnight, then suspended the operation pending daylight. Brennan filed a detailed incident report, noting every element of the encounter, every discrepancy, every detail that did not fit standard protocol. She turned off her radio and returned to the ranger station, her mind churning through possibilities, searching for an explanation that made sense. The following night, while conducting her regular patrol, she received another call at 8:54 p.m., 2 minutes earlier than the previous night, but close enough to establish a pattern. "This is Jason Pruitt," the voice said. "I fell on the Elm Lake Trail. I think my ankle's broken. Can you help me?" Brennan did not respond. She held the radio in her hand, listening to the voice request assistance, describe his location near the eastern platform, detail his injuries. The words were identical to the previous night, not similar, identical. The same phrasing, the same pauses, the same medical terminology. It was not a new call. It was a repeat, a recording, a loop. She drove back to the ranger station and informed her supervisor, a man named Richard Torres, who had worked the park for 15 years. Torres listened to her account, made notes, and suggested the radio might be malfunctioning, picking up old transmissions or interfering with nearby frequencies. Brennan agreed it was possible, but did not believe it. The call was too specific, too interactive. It had responded to her questions in real time. Over the next 2 weeks, the call repeated 4 more times, always between 8:50 and 9:15 p.m., always with the same voice, always reporting the same injury in the same location. Other rangers began receiving it. Chen heard it on April 2nd. Rodriguez heard it on April 7th. A seasonal ranger named Kevin Martinez heard it on April 10th and actually went to search for Pruitt before being called back by dispatch. In mid-April, the park's communication system was inspected by a technician named Harold Webb, who worked for the company that maintained the radio equipment for Texas Parks and Wildlife. Webb was thorough, spending 2 full days checking antennas, testing receivers, examining every component of the system. He found no malfunction, no interference from nearby transmitters, no hardware issues that would explain the anomalous calls. The system was operating perfectly within normal parameters. He suggested the signal might be coming from outside the park, perhaps from a nearby facility or a vehicle passing on the highway. But that did not explain how the caller could describe Brennan's appearance and location in real time during the first encounter. Webb also noted something else: the calls only occurred on nights when a ranger was actively patrolling the Elm Lake Trail. On nights when the trail was not monitored, no calls came in. It was as if the transmission knew when someone was listening. The calls ceased in May, shortly after the park implemented a policy change prohibiting rangers from responding to radio calls on the Elm Lake Trail after dark unless they could visually confirm the presence of an injured hiker. Instead, daytime searches would be conducted the following morning. The policy was controversial. What if someone were genuinely injured and needed immediate help? But after 3 false calls in a single week, management decided the risk of sending rangers into the dark marsh on wild chases outweighed the possibility of a real emergency. Incident Report BR 210412 remains open in the park's files. Rangers are still instructed not to respond to distress calls on the Elm Lake Trail after dark unless they can see the person who is calling. Most rangers follow the policy. A few ignore it, believing that someone might genuinely need help. None have found anyone. But the calls continue, sporadic and unpredictable. Once every few months, a ranger reports hearing the voice of Jason Pruitt on the radio, asking for help, describing his injuries, waiting for someone to find him. Deep in the bayous of southwest Louisiana, a search and rescue volunteer was about to learn that some missing persons should stay missing. It was mid-July of 2022. Terrebonne Parish sprawls across the southeastern corner of Louisiana, a patchwork of bayous, canals, and marsh that dissolves into the Gulf of Mexico. The region is prone to flooding, and during hurricane season, entire communities can become isolated for days when storm surges push seawater inland and rain turns roads into rivers. Search and rescue operations are coordinated through volunteer teams who know the waterways intimately and own boats capable of navigating shallow, debris-choked channels where commercial vessels cannot go. Marcus Hebert had been coordinating volunteer rescue operations in Terrebonne Parish for 8 years. He was 53, a native of Montagut, who had spent his entire life in the marsh. His grandfather had been a trapper. His father had been a shrimper. Marcus had worked both trades before becoming a construction supervisor, but he had never left the bayous. The water was in his blood, as the saying went. He understood the tides, the currents, the way the marsh breathed and shifted with the seasons. On July 18th, Hebert received a call on his cell phone from a number he did not recognize. The area code was Local 985, which covered the entirety of Terrebonne and several neighboring parishes. The call came in at 7:32 p.m., just as dusk was settling over the marsh. Hebert answered, expecting another routine coordination call: a fisherman with engine trouble, a family stranded by rising water, the usual summer emergencies. The voice on the line was older, raspy, with a thick Cajun accent that reminded Hebert of his grandfather. The man identified himself as Raymond Doucet. He stated that his granddaughter, a 16-year-old named Claire, had gone missing 2 days earlier after taking a small boat into the marsh to check on a fishing camp near Bayou du Large. The family had searched for her on their own, Doucet explained, but found nothing. He was calling now because they needed help. Professional help. Someone who knew the marsh and could organize a proper search. Hebert asked for details. Doucet provided the name of the fishing camp called Doucet's Place, a simple structure his family had maintained for 3 generations. He gave coordinates, described the route Claire would have taken, estimated times. Everything sounded legitimate. Hebert agreed to organize a search team and told Doucet they would launch at first light the following morning. Hebert gathered 4 volunteers from his regular roster. They met at the public boat launch in Montagut at 6 a.m. on July 19th. The morning was already warm, the humidity oppressive, promising a scorching day ahead. Doucet had provided coordinates for the fishing camp, a small structure built on pilings in a remote section of Marsh, accessible only by boat. The team launched at 6:15 in 2 vessels, Hebert's 20-foot aluminum boat and a smaller 14-foot skiff operated by a volunteer named Thomas Robichaud. They headed south through Bayou Terrebonne, the main waterway that connected Montagut to the Gulf. The bayou was wide and deep, lined with docks and camps and fishing shacks. As they progressed south, the development thinned. The structures became older, more weathered. Some had been abandoned after hurricanes. Others were used only occasionally, visible only as roof lines rising above the marsh grass. After 40 minutes, they turned west into a network of smaller channels, following Hebert's GPS. The channels narrowed. The water changed from brown to nearly black. The air smelled of sulfur and decay, the characteristic odor of marsh decomposition. Dragonflies hovered in clouds. Herons stood motionless on pilings, watching the boats pass. The team reached the coordinates at 7:42. The fishing camp was there, a wooden shack with a corrugated metal roof, elevated 6 feet above the waterline on thick cypress posts. It appeared abandoned, though that was not unusual. Many camps went unused for months at a time. The door hung open, moving slightly in the breeze. A pirogue was tied to one of the pilings, an old wooden boat that looked handmade, its wood dark with age and water damage. The pirogue was empty and half filled with rainwater, its interior covered in a film of algae. Hebert and 2 volunteers, Robichaud and a man named Carl Guidry, climbed the ladder to inspect the camp. The ladder was slick with moss, requiring careful footing. The camp's interior was sparse, a folding chair, a Coleman stove, a stack of old magazines yellowed and curled by humidity, a cot with a mildewed mattress. There was no sign of Claire, no personal belongings except for the magazines, no indication anyone had been there recently. A layer of dust covered the Coleman stove. Spider webs stretched across the corners. The place felt abandoned, forgotten, left to decay in the marsh. Hebert radioed the phone number Doucet had called from, intending to confirm they had the correct location. The call went to voicemail immediately. He tried twice more over the next 10 minutes. Both attempts went directly to voicemail. The voicemail box was full and would not accept messages. The team spent the next 3 hours searching the surrounding channels in an ever-widening radius. They called Claire's name, their voices carrying across the water and disappearing into the marsh. They checked every nearby structure, though most were collapsed or so overgrown they were barely visible. They examined every sandbar, every cluster of trees where a boat might have run aground. They found nothing, no boat, no gear, no sign a teenage girl had been in the area, recently or ever. At noon, with the sun directly overhead and the temperature approaching 95 degrees, Hebert decided to return to the launch and regroup. They would file a missing person report with the sheriff's office, provide the coordinates and search area, and let the professionals take over. As they were preparing to leave, untying their boats from the camp's pilings, one of the volunteers, a younger man named Peter Bro, noticed something. Attached to the underside of the fishing camp's porch, hidden in shadow and barely visible, was a small, waterproof box. The kind used to store emergency supplies, matches, flares, first aid items. Bro pointed it out. Hebert retrieved it, using a boat hook to dislodge it from the mounting bracket. The box was heavier than expected. When opened, it contained not emergency supplies, but a single item, a digital voice recorder, covered in rust and mud, its case cracked but still sealed against moisture. The battery compartment was corroded, the contacts green with oxidation. But Hebert had spare batteries in his boat. He cleaned the contacts with a wire brush, replaced the batteries, and powered on the device. The screen flickered, then stabilized. There was one file saved in its memory, dated July 16th, 2 days before Doucet's call. The file name was simply Help. Hebert pressed play. The recording began with silence, broken only by the hiss of background noise and the distant sound of water lapping against wood. Then a voice, young, female, frightened, If anyone finds this, my name is Claire Doucet. I came out here with my grandfather to check on his camp. Something's wrong with him. He's not acting right. He keeps saying we need to stay, that we can't leave until the water tells us it's okay. I don't know what he means. He's been staring at the bayou all morning, just standing there, whispering to it. I tried to take the boat, but he won't let me. He hid the oars. I'm going to try to swim to the main channel when he falls asleep. If you find this and I'm not here, please tell my mom I love her. The recording continued for another 2 minutes. Claire described her location, though her description was vague. The old camp on Bayou du Large, which could refer to dozens of structures. She described her grandfather's strange behavior in more detail. He had been normal when they first arrived, helping her check the camp for hurricane damage, inspecting the roof and the pilings. But then he had walked down to the water's edge and had not come back. Not mentally. His body was there, but his mind seemed to be somewhere else. He stared at the water for hours. He whispered in a language Claire did not recognize. When she asked what he was doing, he told her the water was speaking, that it had messages for them, that they needed to listen. Then the recording cut to static. When it resumed 30 seconds later, the voice was different, older, male, the same raspy tone Hebert had heard on the phone. She tried to leave, the voice said. Each word was slow, deliberate, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. The water didn't like that. The water doesn't let go once it knows your name. The recording ended abruptly. Hebert and his team stood in silence, the recorder sitting in Hebert's palm like something cursed. Finally, Robichaud spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to call the police, right now." They immediately contacted the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office via marine radio. A deputy met them at the boat launch 90 minutes later and took possession of the voice recorder, handling it carefully, treating it as potential evidence in a criminal investigation. The sheriff's office ran the name Raymond Doucet through their database that afternoon. They found a record Raymond Doucet had been a resident of Montaigut, a fisherman and trapper, reported missing in August of 2003 after his fishing boat was found drifting empty near Bayou du Large. The boat's engine was still running, his gear was still on board, but Doucet was gone. He was presumed drowned. His body was never recovered, despite an extensive 3-week search involving sheriff's deputies, Coast Guard, and volunteer rescue teams. A search for Claire Doucet was initiated immediately. Deputies interviewed families in Montaigut and surrounding communities. No missing persons report had been filed for anyone by that name. Parish records showed no family currently residing in Terrebonne with the surname Doucet, though the name was common enough in the area's history. School records were checked. No student named Claire Doucet had been enrolled in any Terrebonne Parish school in the past 10 years. The voice on the recording was analyzed by forensic audio specialists. They cleaned up the background noise, isolated the voices, compared them against databases of known individuals. The girl's voice could not be matched to any known person. The older male voice showed characteristics consistent with a speaker in his 60s or 70s, with vocal patterns suggesting native French-speaking background, but it matched no one in law enforcement databases. The fishing camp was demolished 3 months later after the owner, tracked down through property records, stated it had been unused since 2005 and he wanted it removed. The demolition crew reported nothing unusual except that the wood was extremely rotten, more deteriorated than would be expected given the structure's age and construction. The voice recorder remains in evidence storage at the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's. Continue. 729 Office, filed under case number TP 220718. Officers who have listened to it report hearing additional sounds in the background of Claire's recording, whispers that seem to form words, though no words are clearly spoken, the creak of wood, though the camp was reported to be motionless during the recording, and what sounds like something moving through water beneath the structure. The case is classified as unresolved. No further evidence has been discovered. No bodies have been found. Marcus Hebert still coordinates rescue operations in Terrebonne Parish, but he no longer accepts calls from numbers he does not recognize. He screens every communication, verifies every request through secondary sources, and refuses to launch searches based solely on phone calls. His volunteers understand. They do not question his caution. Hundreds of miles north, in the wetlands of Michigan, a conservation officer was about to receive a distress call that would force her to question everything she thought she understood about rescue protocol. It was early October of 2023. The Shiawassee National Wildlife Refuge, nearly 10,000 acres of flooded timber, cattail marsh, and braided waterways stretching across central Michigan, was entering its busiest season. Autumn migration transformed the refuge into a living sky, a place where hundreds of thousands of ducks and geese filled the air with movement and sound. The Mississippi Flyway carried them like a river of wings, and the marsh beneath pulsed with their presence. For most visitors, it was a spectacle. For Conservation Officer Amy Stoltz, it was work. Stoltz had spent 7 years patrolling these wetlands, enforcing hunting rules, guiding lost visitors back to shoreline, and assisting when hunters got stuck in the soft-bottom mud that could swallow a man to the waist in seconds. The refuge's dikes and access roads made navigation seem simple, but once you stepped off the solid ground and into the cattails, the world became a maze. Landmarks shifted, distances stretched, sound carried strangely across the water. Even experienced hunters could become disoriented. On October 11th, at 3:54 p.m., Stoltz received a call from a man identifying himself as Carl Voss. His voice was steady, irritated more than afraid. He said he'd gotten separated from his partner while duck hunting in the northeast marsh. They hadn't checked in at the refuge station, he admitted, because they'd arrived before opening. An infraction, yes, but a common one. What mattered was getting him out safely. His phone battery was at 15%. He'd been walking for over an hour, but everything looked the same. Endless cattails, patches of dead timber, shallow water in every direction. Stoltz asked him to identify landmarks. He couldn't, nothing but marsh. But as he spoke, his description did not narrow his position, it widened it. The entire refuge sounded like where he claimed to be. The only way to locate him precisely was to ping his phone. She pulled his coordinates from the emergency locator system. The map placed him in Ferguson Bayou, a difficult and seasonally flooded stretch of marsh. In October, depending on rainfall, the water could be ankle-deep or chest-deep. She loaded her ATV with gear and headed out. The afternoon was fading into evening. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the water. Migrating geese called overhead, their cries echoing through the cool air. She reached the closest access point at 4:27 and called Voss to confirm his location. "I'm here," he said immediately. "I can see your vehicle." Stoltz scanned the marsh. Nothing moved except the cattails. She asked what he saw. His answer chilled her. He described her ATV exactly. The olive green body, the service logo, the rear rack, even the dent on the fender from an accident she never reported. "How far are you from me?" she asked. 100 feet, he said. "You should be able to see me if you look carefully." She stepped into the marsh, water rising to her knees. The bottom sucked at her boots, and the cattails formed dense walls around her. She called out his name, her voice dissolved into the reeds. She checked the GPS. She was close, 50 feet, 30 feet. She should have seen him by now. Her phone rang. "Voss." "You're getting closer," he said, voice soft, patient. Something was wrong. The air had cooled unnaturally. The light dimmed even though sunset was still half an hour away. She asked him to make a sound. Anything. Clap, splash, speak loudly. There was silence. Then he whispered, "Why can't you see me?" The water had risen to her chest. The bottom beneath her feet felt impossibly soft, as if she were standing on a living thing that shifted under her weight. Stoltz turned and began forcing her way back toward the road. Her breath came fast. The cattails closed in behind her like a curtain. "Don't leave," Voss said through the phone. "Please, I've been waiting so long for someone to find me." She hung up. She did not answer again. It took 20 minutes to crawl back to solid ground. By the time she reached her ATV, she was shaking, soaked, covered in algae and mud. She called headquarters and requested a full search team with drones and thermal imaging. 6 officers searched the bayou until nightfall. They found muskrats, deer, and waterfowl. No humans, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign anyone had been present in the marsh that day. The coordinates she had pinged were accurate, but the marsh showed no evidence of a hunter. The phone number that contacted her was traced to a prepaid cell purchased in Saginaw in October 2013. The phone had been active for 1 day and unused for nearly a decade. According to the carrier, it was impossible for it to have made or received calls. Refuge records showed no hunting permits for anyone named Carl Voss in 15 years. A search of state databases revealed the truth. A man named Carl Voss had drowned in Ferguson Bayou in October 2013. He had hunted alone, slipped in deep water, and his waders filled, pinning him in the mud. Search teams recovered his body 3 days later. His death had been a cautionary tale for new rangers. And the phone he carried in 2013, the same prepaid model, had been recovered from his body, waterlogged, destroyed. It had never worked again. Yet 10 years later, it called her. The incident was logged as SNW 231011. The case remains technically open but inactive. Stoltz transferred to upland patrols the following spring, refusing any assignments involving wetlands. She never again entered water deeper than a few inches. The number that called her has never responded to pings. It does not exist in any functioning network. But each October, when the geese return and the hunters spread through the marsh, unknown calls appear on ranger phones. The voices describe their surroundings with impossible accuracy. They ask for help finding the way out. And each call ends the same way. "Why can't you see me?" Most rangers no longer answer during hunting season. Those who still do usually wish they hadn't. The American wetlands remain among the most deceptive landscapes we have. They shift with tides, erase trails overnight, turn solid-looking ground into bottomless mud, and blur the line between land and water until even trained responders must trust their instincts more than their eyes. In that liminal space, between fog and darkness, sound and silence, voices call for help, and those who answer them often discover that not every plea belongs to the living. The cases tonight are not rumors or legends. They exist in dispatch logs, GPS records, recorded calls, and official reports obtained through public channels. What remains unexplained is not whether they happened, they did, but what intelligence was speaking through the marshes, and why it knew so much about the rescuers trying to help. These voices described clothing, vehicles, and positions before responders reported them. They gave accurate directions into areas where no caller could physically be. They adapted to conversation. They waited. Yet none of the responders were harmed. They returned shaken, confused, but physically untouched, as if whatever called them wanted proximity, not capture. Some investigators believe these encounters are echoes of the drowned. Others think the wetlands themselves hold a kind of consciousness. A few claim stress-induced hallucination, though that theory collapses under the weight of identical multi-witness reports and recordings capturing voices that should not exist, voices matching people long confirmed dead. The wetlands, remember, they breathe. They hold stories like water cupped in a hand, revealing them only to those who venture too deep or listen too closely. And somewhere in that darkness, the voices are still calling, patient and persistent, using the language of emergency because they know someone will always come. If you have a story of your own, share it. These accounts survive because people are willing to speak. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.